I'm tempted to just let Lee continue to read my bio instead of do this talk. I want to thank Lee very much for that lovely introduction. And I want to thank Dean Mary Wildner Bassett as well for her force in making humanities work. Also at the College of Humanities, Helen, Amanda, Jenna, Nate, and Melissa, the ACE College of Humanities External Relations team. They're the ones making all the logistical stuff happen. They're fantastic. And then here at the planetarium, Bill, Michael, and Rosie, I want especially to thank them as well for all their support. It's really wonderful to be able to use this venue, and at least, even if you don't like my talk, you got to see a shooting star, right? So, wait for a moment here while is the desktop up? This is the most technology I've ever used at one time. 2 microphones, multiple lights, a clicker. Well, I tell you what, let me just go ahead and get started, and then when the slides come up, we'll add those in. I also want to mention Tim Swindle. Where is Tim? Professor Tim Swindle is director of the Lunar Planetary Laboratory, and if you come to the second talk at 6, you'll get to see pictures of Tim in Antarctica. That's not the only thing you'll see, but Tim has kindly brought some meteorites to the exhibit hall, so once you exit the lecture, you can take a look at some of those meteorites. And of course, there's some in the planetarium itself. So let me begin. This is a talk about meteorites and sort of how we viewed them. I appreciated Lee talking about the body, which is the theme for the English department this year, because as it turns out, a lot of the mythology of shooting stars has to do with the body. So let me begin. On any clear night, under a dark enough sky, we can see shooting stars. We wish upon them even if we don't quite know what they are. Of course, they're not really stars. And even if we don't know where they come from or what they might tell us about the universe. It's as if we're eager to pin our chances on something strange and sudden, something beautiful beyond our ken. Across cultures and time, we have written ourselves into the sky. We create constellations, transforming the random spatter of stars into shapes and stories. We name planets after gods. And we associate meteors and meteorites, the light of dust or rocks burning passage through the air, a meteor, and the rocks that sometimes fall afterwards, meteorites, with the most elemental aspects of our lives: good luck, ill fortune, and even death. Meteorites are in fact implicated in the seeding of life's ingredients on Earth, and even the most indifferent know that these bits of former asteroids have rained devastation in the past and threaten to do so in the future. Meteorites are the alpha and omega of geology. These rocks, mere rocks, encompass the fact of life and death on our planet. Well, not surprisingly, we try to tame the wildness of meteorites by incorporating them into popular culture. Movies show humanity outgunning asteroids or comets headed for Earth, or at least surviving the effects of massive impacts. Accounts of actual space rocks whizzing by are now relegated to the inside pages of newspapers. It seems we've had too many close calls. Then again, the front page of the July 5th, 2004 Weekly World News announced another meteor fells Pope. Let that sink in for a second. Amazingly, the 900-pound stone did not kill him, though the photo shows the pontiff unhappy under all that weight. I don't know how this escaped the mainstream media's attention, but there it is. An episode of Gilligan's Island called Meet the Meteor featured a meteorite that accelerated the aging of the hapless castaways, but they survived, and the professor even made a Geiger counter out of bamboo. In an otherwise forgettable movie, My Super Ex-Girlfriend, Uma Thurman got her superpowers from a meteorite. So humor dilutes threats, as does possession, literal or metaphoric. We can set meteorites on our mantles, displaying them as specimens, including some iron meteorites that have been melted into fantastic shapes, like Henry Moore sculptures, and sometimes just as pricey. An English breakfast cereal, Shreddies, once included little packets of meteorite dust as a promotional giveaway, and I've wondered how many kids sprinkled their new treats over cereal and milk. More poignantly, we christen asteroids to make them serve our needs. Astronomers have bestowed the names Solidarity, Magnanimity, and Compassion upon 3 asteroids as tributes to the victims of the September 11th attacks. Eros and Thanatos, indeed, Freud might have said. Meteors, shooting stars, flash across the sky all the time. Some of them contain rocks that are large enough to fall more or less intact onto the Earth's surface. This has been happening for billions of years. Covertly dark or blandly gray, often woefully misshapen, that's what many meteorites look like. Lumps so ordinary seeming that most people never notice these rocks have landed on farm fields, deserts, shorelines, or backyards. The untrained eye can even mistake some meteorites for chunks of concrete, as if a cosmic road crew had jackhammered a solar highway and sent its congeries spilling down, briefly lit, to land among soybeans or ferns. Those who quest for meteorites, however, recognize them amidst the average rubble of the earth, the way a birder hears rare song untangling itself from a forest full of sound. Amateur collectors, professional dealers, and planetary scientists are eager to obtain and understand these stones. They have gone and still go to great lengths to gain such exotic things as a water-trapping H5 chondrite, a snick from Mars, or an igneous calcium-poor urolite. Many people, myself among them, discount the notions of heavenly jurisdiction over a person's life, whether it's thinking your wish upon a falling star has come true or simply believing in a horoscope. Yet I found that in actual and often moving ways, the fallen sky can reveal secrets not only of the solar system, but of our hearts. That is why this is an intimate history of shooting stars. We go out hunting meteorites, and some of us find ourselves as well. Years ago, when I lived in eastern Kansas, I was trying to deepen my connection to the tallgrass prairie to find stories that might enrich those austere horizons. Thumbing through a volume by the nature writer Edwin Teale, I came across the history of a homesteading farm wife who harvested not only wheat, but one of the rarest meteorites known to science. I was then also writing a book about extinct birds and couldn't yet fathom that the grief I felt about their fates was also in part an expression of many inarticulate griefs I carried in my life. Prompted by those inner darknesses and by the words of Teale and others, I went outside at night and looked up. I saw and learned the stars. I used them as a balm. And I saw meteors. Sudden thin streaks on any given night, showers of them in the summer, watching with my wife as we camped beside a marsh and sand dunes in Colorado and in our front yard, the one I'd walk away from, long after fireballs had exploded one November, golden shocks in the sky. So all this led me to learn more about meteorites than I ever thought I could. This is a picture of Antarctica, a little preview for the next lecture. So this book is also a chronicle of some of the most important meteorites we know of, stones that have altered our knowledge of the solar system and our place in it, and as such serves as a kind of informal record of scientific recognitions. The science is so fast-moving it's difficult to keep up, and it ranges from studying the primordial delivery of amino acids in meteorites to assessing the dangers of asteroids classified by epic names such as Atens and Apollos. I've especially tried to convey how individuals and cultures have valued meteorites, how they've been venerated as objects of power and continue to be objects of profit. But also, and this is crucial, how meteorites have become, through the rigors of science and the marvels of story, objective correlatives for our desire to live with both explanation and mystery. Well, when Chicken Little felt an acorn or rose petal or pea land on her head, she thought the sky was falling and sounded her insistent alarm. In some versions of this story, many of Chicken Little's animal friends are eaten by the duplicitous fox. A mistaken perception about some wider accident is enough to trigger a different disaster. Being eaten is no less awful than untrustworthy air. We're meant to understand, therefore, that skepticism and courage are laudable traits, and many who seek shooting stars have them. But it's important to recall that in other versions of the story, the sky does fall. Perhaps it matters little if that sky is the big one we walk under or the one we carry inside ourselves. When I began this project years ago, I believed the story of Chicken Little was just a children's tale I could deploy for poetic effect, or maybe as a parable for the threats to civilization posed by rogue asteroids. I couldn't yet see the story as a parable for our lives, nor did I appreciate how deeply the human need to tell stories about meteors abides. And as I began to learn of this need, I found not only a sense of wonder and had adventures from Kansas to Greenland, from Arizona to Antarctica, I began to learn that sometimes astonishment carries a price, and so I could better understand so many of the ancient metaphors. Meteors as blood, as tears, as burning hearts in the sky, and meteorites as gods. Gods being always, of course, versions of ourselves. So consider that the oldest story in Western culture, the Epic of Gilgamesh, prominently features a meteorite. And here's the king himself. It's a 5,000-year-old story, at least 5,000 years old. And this is a quote from one of the translations. And it mentions Ninsun, who is a god. Then Ninsun, who is well-beloved and wise, said to Gilgamesh, "This star of heaven, which descended like a meteor from the sky, which you tried to lift but found too heavy, when you tried to move it, it would not budge, and so you brought it to my feet. I made it for you, a goad and spur, and you were drawn as though to a woman." The meteorite represents, we soon learn, the arrival of a wild man, a rival to Gilgamesh named Enkidu, who will become his friend and lover. And the two of them have adventures, pay a price, a terrible price, for killing a monster, and learn that nothing lasts forever but the gods that protect and torment us. Well, centuries later, beneath a sky that once rained bacon, and I have to explain why that was the case, because we usually don't find pork falling from the sky these days. There are a lot of European folklore that deals with things coming from the sky. Shields, entire animals, rocks. And so the idea that rocks would fall from the sky was bound up in a belief that was sort of folkloric. For a long time then, it was impossible to think that rocks could actually fall from the sky. So I once stood beneath the sky that rained bacon, and I was looking for the oldest meteorite in Western culture. I was in this place, Ensensheim, France. It's near the German border. And I went there to find this rock. It didn't take too long because it's in a museum. But this is the story. This is a picture from Ensensheim. And you can see here a fireball and a rock coming out of the clouds. Well, at Ensensheim in Alsace, the oldest known witnessed meteorite fall in Western history took place on November 7th, 1492. In at least one chronicle, the stone that landed here is given equal prominence with Columbus's discovery of the New World. No one could explain the sudden appearance of a rock falling from the sky above Ensensheim without resorting to the word miracle. A little more than 300 years after Ensensheim and about 300 miles away, not far from Paris, the sky would rain not one rock, but thousands. And there would be so many witnesses who were credible that scientists would begin to understand that indeed rocks come from the sky. But on the November day in Ensensheim, November 7th, 1492, I want to focus on a boy. He was, it seems, alone in a wheat field the day of the fall, or perhaps he'd not yet arrived there. Perhaps he walked with a woven basket on his back and carried a pitchfork. A rope around his waist would have kept his tunic tight against the autumn chill. In early November, the wheat probably had been sown. He was not, as legend has it, tending sheep. Sometime between 11 a.m. and noon, the clear air burst with sound. He must have flinched. He must have seen a fiery cloud in the sky. Did he cower? Did he run toward town? Along the flight path, the thunder diminished, the loudest noises having occurred earliest in the descent. At Ensensheim, there was a rumble. Scientists have concluded that the meteor's southeast to northwest approach took it over the Rhine until it burst at a point above and between two villages where terrified residents prayed for safety. Slowed by air, the meteor lost its original cosmic velocity, the speed at which it enters the atmosphere, which is typically around 40,000 miles per hour. And at that retardation point, a sonic boom sounded. Then the rock fell under the influence of gravity, until, affected by aerodynamics, it was traveling at about 200 miles per hour. After the stone hit, imagine the whomp, the plashing dirt. Our nameless boy may have stood over a hole a few feet deep, the black rock at its bottom. Was he curious enough to crawl in? Was he afraid he'd be swallowed up? Did he pray? How soon did others come? There had to be a reason for the fall, but just what the miracle foretold, no one knew. One original account, and this is the one you see here, it's in a booklet that you can buy at the museum in Ensensheim, says that the fall of the rock was so obvious it was, quote, as if God wanted people to find it. That they did. Despite edges sharp enough to cut and a weight of about 300 pounds, the stone was hauled out, whereupon villagers began hacking at it until a magistrate told them to stop. They took the rock to the church, whereupon it was closer to God. When the German professor and poet Sebastian Brandt of nearby Basel heard news of the fall, and apparently he heard the explosion but didn't actually see the fireball itself, this man of letters did not have religion on his mind. He was thinking about politics. Brandt dashed off a poem. He was a versifier with all the subtlety of a dredge, and his stanzas soon reached thousands of people, and this is what he wrote. May the one who marvels at listening to weird stories remember this report. He recited the usual litany of a sky jammed with bacon, shields of blood and fire, tiles, flesh, wool of the celestial wrath. He claimed the Ensensheim stone had a crucifix and symbols written on it. It didn't, but that really was beside the point. For him, the tri-cornered stone meant the Trinity, which meant, for him, special calamities for the French, which was convenient, since Brandt wanted King Maximilian to attack them. Meanwhile, another authority figure, a cardinal, believed that the meteorite presaged a different attack, that of venereal disease. 3 weeks after the fall, Maximilian, then apparently that didn't happen, but 3 weeks after the fall, Maximilian trotted into town with his troops, viewed the stone, considered it divine, took 2 fragments, after which he ordered no further molestation of the rock, and he proceeded to whip the French in battle. There's no word on whether he met the boy. The meteorite stayed in the air, hung aloft in the church until the French Revolution, when the putatively rational reactionaries could not abide stories about falling sky stones. So residents decided to move the rock to another town to keep it safe from all the hotheads. Returned in 1804, the meteorite was eventually displayed in the Regency, which would become the museum that now houses the largest remaining fragment. Its tenure since then has been pretty uneventful, although there's a story that a woman came over after World War II claiming to represent something called the Museum of Massachusetts, which does not exist, and offered a lot of money for this rock. And it was then that the villagers realized that this stone was really pretty important. So what's left of Ensensheim here, after all these various whacks over the centuries, is a mass that weighs about 120 pounds. I think it sits in its case like a siren song made solid. When I visited, the docent even opened the vitrine so I could reach in to touch this historic meteorite. Very few people get to do that, so I was really excited. I grazed my hand across the slightly stippled surface. It felt like rough, dry soap. It felt like hard dough worked over with hobnails. I was transfixed. The oldest known meteorite fall in Western history, a stone that landed the year that Columbus landed in North America. I wanted to bear hug this rock. Well, the power attributed to Ensensheim, that magic, is in keeping with how shooting stars and meteorites have been viewed by many people in many places, as messages from the divine, as signals of fate. In ancient European and Near Eastern cultures, meteorites were worshipped. Various Greek and Roman temples may have held them, and meteorites' origins were partly understood. Diogenes of Apollonia said meteorites were, quote, invisible stars that fell from earth, or fell to earth and died out. Egyptian hieroglyphs noted that iron meteorites come from heaven, and some were even buried in pyramids. In Mecca, the Kaaba stone is enshrined in a mosque as a meteorite, although now most people think it's a terrestrial stone. In Asia, the Chinese long understood that rocks fell from the sky. During the 13th and 14th century, one scholar wrote a chronicle that recorded some 2,000 years of meteorite falls. In Japan, Shokujo, the goddess of household skills, was thought to use meteorites to steady her loom. The world's oldest well-dated witness fall took place in Japan, in Nagata, on May 19th, 861 AD, and that stone remains at a temple. Different cultures have different answers. I don't know, when you watch the shooting star come across, if you thought it was okay to wish upon it. I mean, you know, it wasn't really a shooting star, but you might have thought you could do that. And that's a typical reaction, right, that we wish upon a falling star. In the Middle Ages, some believed that the number of seconds counted before a shooting star vanishes equaled the number of years in which you'll have good eyesight. A Swiss tale suggests that meteors can stave off illnesses. But not everyone welcomes a falling star. The Barunga of Africa would exhort a shooting star to go away, all by yourself. In Siberia, meteors are considered blood-sucking fireworms. The Dobu of the Western Pacific believed that meteors were the volcanic crystals coming from the vaginas of flying witches. The Kung use a term for meteors that means evil thunder wizard named Mucus who sneezes blood. And of course, meteor storms such as this have long been seen as suggesting the end of the world. Meteorites themselves have been taboo in some places. Nigerian natives attributed a smallpox plague to the theft of a meteorite by British troops. Various tribal cultures have had all sorts of strictures against touching or using meteorites or even speaking of them. But still, from Greenland to Mexico, cosmic iron has been worked into knife blades, beads, and other implements. I think the richest folklore of meteors and meteorites is that which connects them to the body. And not just human bodies. Meteors have been seen as other creatures as well, such as dragons or bats. Just as the Inuit of Greenland thought of excretory functions when they saw meteors or discovered meteorites, so too have other societies. In one Chinese dialect, the word for meteors means stool of the thunder gods. In Greek, the word means to have gas. A Baja tribe in California thought that meteors were, quote, fiery urine. And the idea of these excretions coming from our body can mean all sorts of things. Among the Maya, it included blood, urine, sweat, mucus, afterbirth, a whole long list. Not to get too gross then. So a more fetching story from China of the jewel of Qianpiao, which was a pheasant and a meteor all at the same time, and it would cross the sky, and the female pheasants would respond to its passionate cries. In another version of the Epic of Gilgamesh, the king of Uruk doesn't just dream about the meteorite, he actually marries it. Well, we can view the world scientifically while keeping in mind or heart these enduring metaphors of a sensual sky. Metaphors are like the movies. We go to them suspending our disbelief so we can be swept up in a fiction that enlightens. We've made the sky a kind of body to remind ourselves of its function of necessity, of ardor. Perhaps in doing so, we give the sky itself a kind of immortality that we lack. We invest the sky with a timelessness as recompense for our own passages. If the sky becomes a body that goes on, we with actual bodies have not escaped the wounds and deaths we fear. So we find almost everywhere the archetypal belief that shooting stars are dying souls or somehow related to death. Fate breaks off a thread for each person, Lithuanians say, at death, a falling thread, a meteor. The Hindu believed that meteors were the offspring of Rahu's severed body, according to one folklore dictionary I have at home. And among some Mayans, a meteorite leads to an alligator-infested lake, which really kind of seems too bad. Meanwhile, the Irish believed that the Perseids, and this is a picture of the Perseid meteor shower that occurs every summer, were the tears of the martyred St. Lawrence. Then again, sometimes it's just a matter of circumstance. Ancient Middle Eastern texts emphasize that the outcomes of witnessing a meteor depended on the person's state of mind, where the meteor appeared, and in what direction relative to the observer. All these factors could mean the difference for that observer between life and death. For all the wonderful variety of beliefs associated with meteorites and meteors, the view of just one man came to dominate Western understanding of these phenomena. Aristotle, who taught that meteors were streaks of light created by earthly vapors, water, air, and fire. So they came up, they didn't fall down. This belief and its derivations persisted for many centuries. A 16th century natural history called A Goodly Gallery by William Falk derives from these classical views. And he wrote about everything from dragons to a lake whose water causes Italians, of all people, to abstain from drinking wine. So I don't know how trustworthy a source he really was. Of shooting stars, William Falk claimed that they were exhalations slipping about the Earth's atmosphere that presented the illusion of falling. For after all, he asked a very logical question, if stars could fall, wouldn't the Earth be glutted with them? Wouldn't we walk on stars instead of meadows? It took the Enlightenment to prompt harder questions, questions not only logical but daring, questions that challenged the sway of rigid classical and Christian views of the world, questions that arose slowly and forcefully, not from theological dictum, but careful observation. And all that careful observation led slowly to our understanding that rocks falling from the sky actually did happen, not just from volcanoes. That rocks falling from the sky ultimately came from space. That rocks falling from the sky burned at incredible velocities and temperatures, and that by studying meteors and meteorites, we could understand the nature of our solar system and our place in it. And oddly enough, the scientific story begins not with mythical heroes or heavenly saints, but something so ordinary, it's hard to imagine how vital it is. It begins with dust. Dust gets a bad rap. It's an adjective for products whose nouns are mop, remover, or buster. In Queen's song, which I won't sing for you, another one bites the dust. The rock group Kansas whimpered that all we are is dust in the wind. The slow shall be left in the dust. The feckless shall eat my dust. History, when forgotten, dies in a dustbin. Dust to dust, we're told, emphasis on the dry conclusion. Despite the welcome richness of gold dust, which is preferable, a rainstorm or a dust storm? Given its rarity, gold dust doesn't kick up in high winds to smother homesteads and towns. Other dust, from prosaic to suffocating, dominates our lives. 20 years ago, when I first moved from Indiana to Kansas, I started a job and kept brushing what I thought were eraser shavings off my desk. And I looked up and I saw an orange sky. It was a dust storm. I thought I had moved to the apocalypse. There are no dams that will stop a flood of dust. Most of us prefer rain. The dictionary offers this disagreeable definition of dust. 1, powdery earth or other matter in bits fine enough to be easily suspended in air. 2, a cloud of such matter. 3, confusion, turmoil. 4a, earth, especially as a place of burial. B, mortal remains disintegrated or thought of as disintegrating to earth or dust. A humble or abject condition, anything worthless. When I lived in Kansas, nearly every morning I'd wet old rags, then tie them to a broom. I'd push, turn, and drag the jury-rigged mop across oak floors, retrieving especially egregious aggregations from beneath the bed. Then I would step to the front stoop, lift the yellow dust mop to the sky, as if it were a banner in my war on entropy, and shake it like mad. Hair, grit, mites, skin, floss, lint, insect bits, pollens, seed, poof, all manner of heinous detritus. With cheer, I launched them all. The cloud usually traveled east toward a neighbor's yard, but he never complained. Had he, I might have told him that dust is life, even if it makes us sneeze. Dust, it turns out, is Genesis. The story of the solar system and all that follows, from meteorites and those who cherish them, begins with dust. Stars died. They exploded. There were, researchers have conjectured, perhaps up to 10 supernovae whose traces we can read in the solar system today. When such stars explode, the remains gather together at a far distance to start again as dust, entrained with capes of gas. Supernovae occur when large stars, those about 25 times heftier than our sun, can no longer burn. They've run out of fuel, one element after another having been gobbled up through hunger and change. After burning hydrogen, helium, carbon, neon, and oxygen in successfully shorter ages, comes the last day in the life of such a star, a few hours fueled by silicon. Within the star, iron is about to be shredded like a puffball because iron makes less energy than it needs in order to be a fusion source. One ordinary second ends it all. The star collapses, sending shockwaves slamming through it, and the star just rips apart. Previously, the star had expelled carbon gas, which eventually condenses into diamonds. Countless trillions of diamonds, as scientist Harry McSween puts it, but not a single one will ever grace a pendant or seal a marriage vow. The supernova itself casts out, among other things, a rare form of xenon that infuses into these interstellar diamonds. And some of these microdiamonds make their way into meteorites that land on Earth. It took 2 decades of painstaking work by chemist Edward Anders, and other scientists to coax from meteorites all these traces of interstellar material. Oxygen, plutonium, and iodine are forged in the hearts of dying stars, gold too, all that sent forth in a flash of iron demise. So stardust soared from explosions brighter than galaxies. Gas billowed, shock waves with their linty freight hit other particles and gases already lingering in one small pocket of the Milky Way. Then gravity rescued it. About 4.6 billion years ago, this cloud of dust and gas slowly began to contract, rotate, and flatten. The heart of the presolar nebula began to quicken, and within a few thousand years, a protostar, not yet fusing hydrogen, went through phases of contraction, expansion, and varied brightness. It took some 10,000 years for outward gas pressure to balance against gravitational contraction, then another 10 million years for the protostar to condense just enough to create what became our sun. Grains, flecks, and pebbles accreted into rocks. They became careening piles of rocks, then boulders upon boulders. Once these objects were more than a half-mile wide, gravity superseded chance accretion, electrostatic attraction and drag, speeding up the formation of the asteroids. These minor planets were born, and from them would come meteorites. Easily told in a few sentences, this transformation from dusty disk to solar system took millions of years. Dust birthed the planets, and here we are on Earth. So you need not be a meteorite scientist or meteorite collector to touch this body, for it reaches us every day, though in forms, dust, and micrometeorites too small to notice without fancy equipment. But one such scientist who studies space dust, there are specialists who do this, a guy named Donald Brownlee, wonderful scientist, once said that if you had lettuce for lunch, you probably ate a few cosmic dust particles. I love this image of the cosmos begetting us and our hungers, and our hunger eating up the cosmos in a salad at Denny's. So if you stuck your tongue out on a winter's day tasting the snow, which you can do, up in the Catalinas at least, here, you may have swallowed meteor dust. We're all eating stars every day. About 40,000 tons of space dust reach us each year, or it's more like 100,000 tons of dust and rocks, according to another source. It works out to about 274 tons each day. The scientist Robert Dodd calculates that if the annual infall of space material is somewhere between 100 and 1,000 tons daily, then after 4.5 billion years, this infall would amount to a layer 5 feet deep. Meteorite collectors would only need a shovel. But weather and geology, rain, deposition, lava, shifting landforms all conspire to hide what falls. Fortunately, though, meteorite hunters and dealers and meteorite scientists travel the globe to find these rocks from space, and the stories of their trials, their tribulations, their successes and joys will be the subject of the next talk in an hour, our next encounter with the fallen sky. Thank you.